Hello, my name's Carole Bingley and I'm Technical Specialist at RSSL. Today I'd like to talk to you about product reformulation. So I'd like to start by giving a brief introduction to RSSL and then move on to the nutritional drivers for reformulation and then start to talk about some of the other reasons why manufacturers may look to reformulate their products and finish up by covering a couple of case studies. So RSSL, or Reading Scientific Services Limited, we're based in Reading in the UK, and we support the food industry with a variety of different services, right from very start of projects, so the concept part of developing a product, right through the development cycle, helping to support to manufacture and post-manufacture. I work in the research and development team, and some of the services we offer are highlighted here on the screen. So we carry out product development, so again, right through from concept, taking it through to launch, and we have a well-equipped development kitchen and pilot plant to be able to support with that. We then offer characterization services, so to help understand the flavor profile or the physical and structural characters of those products. We can carry out ingredient analysis and help to substantiate any claims that you may want to make on pack. If you're using a new ingredient or developing a new ingredient, we can develop analytical methods to be able to measure the levels of that ingredient. We also have a regulatory consultancy service focusing heavily on novel foods approval. And finally, we also carry out stability and shelf life studies on behalf of our clients. So manufacturers are under a lot of pressure to address the nutritional profile of their products, and this pressure is coming from a variety of different places. So NGOs, government, the consumer groups, the need for front of pack labeling. So we're seeing that in some areas. Governments have brought in legislation which involves taxing the products if they exceed a certain sugar level in products. And I'll talk a little bit about new legislation that's coming into force in the UK later this year around addressing the fat, sugar, and salt content of products. But also, consumers are looking for messaging on the front of pack. So it may be through Nutri-Score, through traffic light labeling, or through claims around levels of certain ingredients in the product. So the high fat, sugar and salt restrictions, or HFSS, as I said, are coming into force in October this year, and these restrictions will impact on products in terms of the way products can be promoted, the location of those products in store or on websites, and also how those products are advertised. And whether a product is subject to these restrictions is classed using this nutrient profile model, which is shown on the screen. And the, basically, the model takes into account the calories, the energy density of the product, the saturated fat level, sugars, and the sodium level. And by looking at these and assigning a score to each component of the product, you get your A points. You then look at the protein, fruit, vegetable, and nut and fiber content of the product, and these are the C points. And your final score is achieved by subtracting the C points from the A points. If that final score is 4 or over for a food or 1 or over for a beverage, then the product is subject to HFSS restrictions. And one slight caveat to note is that if the A points for a product exceed 11, then you can't take the protein points into account. So this means that you can't have a product which is high in fat, sugar, and salt, and simply increase the protein content to manage the score. You need to address the other components of the product before the protein can be used. The restrictions don't apply to all products, so the categories which are included are shown on the screen. So these have been selected as the products which contributes most heavily to children's diets, because the whole point of these restrictions are to try and tackle childhood obesity. There are a few exceptions which so things like pastry products, which haven't been included. But we understand that this list is not a finite list, and it may be expanded in the future. When reformulating for nutritional reasons, manufacturers have two main avenues available to them. So one is to go down the overt route, where you're looking to make a claim on the front of pack and inform your consumer that the product has been reformulated in some way. Obviously, to be able to make these claims, it's necessary that the product meets nutrition claims legislation. Um, but the benefit is that you're making a clear message to your consumers and helping them to understand why the product may have changed in some way, and also helping them to make a choice between maybe a product which is slightly higher in salt or sugar compared to this reformulated product. The other avenue is to carry out stealth reformulation, and the benefit here is that you can make very small changes over a period of time, and so almost take your consumer on a journey where they're less likely to notice those differences in taste or texture. Um, and you can see that this was carried out quite successfully with salt, and it was over a 10-year period. So this is quite a long-term program, but the average salt content of bread was reduced from 1.2 grams per 100 grams down to 1 over a 10-year period. And consumers were taken along by these small changes. The downside is that you can't communicate this to the consumer in any way, so that they're not aware of these changes. So they may not be driven to select your product over a competitor. Also, this approach worked well for salt, but salt tends to be a fairly small component of an overall formulation. So it's easier in a way to just rebalance the formulation to account for that small amount of ingredient that you've taken out. It's more difficult if you're using an ingredient which makes up a much larger proportion of the formulation. So, for example, sugar. It is more difficult to make these small changes over time, because actually even a 5% reduction in sugar actually represents a fairly large change to your formulation. So considerations that need to be taken into account when reformulating for nutritional drivers and for other reasons as well. So I've mentioned taste and texture. Consumers can be very sensitive to small changes, particularly in those products that they buy regularly. And one approach that we've seen that's quite successful by some manufacturers is actually, rather than talking about what's been taken out of the product, it's emphasizing the positives. So if the fiber content or the dairy content of the product has been increased, then some manufacturers have chosen to talk about this, and then the fact that the sugar's been reduced is almost sort of a sideline to those positives. Another area is shelf life and product stability. So reducing salt and sugar can result in an increase in the water activity, and so the product may be more susceptible to microbial growth. And this may necessitate the addition of a preservative or changes to the packaging or processing of the product to ensure that it is stable and safe to eat over shelf life. Reducing the saturated fat content of products, and maybe replacing that saturated fat with unsaturated fats may mean that the product is more prone to rancidity. So it may be a packaging solution for this, or it may be the addition of an antioxidant. On the labeling side, we know across the whole food industry that this clean label trend is huge, and that we see it across all categories. And although salt and sugar maybe are ingredients that are really sort of in the spotlight for reformulation, they're also ingredients that consumers are very familiar with. You know, they buy them at home, they know what they are. The alternatives that we may use to replace these can be less familiar to consumers, and that can be an issue on back of pack. And also, I've just mentioned on shelf life, you may need to add other ingredients, so things like preservatives or antioxidants to help maintain shelf life. And again, this can go against the overall objective for the product of maybe keeping a short ingredient line with recognizable ingredients. And then cost can also be an issue here. So particularly where in products where you can't use water to replace whatever ingredient you're taking out, you're having to put an alternative ingredient in, and often those alternatives are more expensive than the bulk ingredient being replaced. So this means that formulation ingredient cost increases. So manufacturers are left with a few different options here. So they can increase the price of the product. This can be challenging sometimes because consumers are seeing that you've taken something out of their product, so why would it be more expensive? You could reduce the pack size whilst charging the same amount. Again, this can be a little bit confusing. Consumers sometimes see the reduction in pack size as the way the manufacturer has reduced, for example, the sugar content, rather than appreciating that it's actually the amount of sugar in the formulation that's been reduced. It's nothing to do with the pack size or the serving size. Or finally, do you accept that you've got a reduced margin on this product? And the upside may be if you've reformulated to avoid, for example, the HFSS restrictions, you have greater freedom in terms of how that product is promoted and advertised, therefore driving growth of your product. So moving on to some of the other reasons that manufacturers may look to reformulate their products, cost. So it may be that one particular ingredient in the formulation has suddenly increased in cost, and so looking to replace that, or it may be as part of a program of overall cost reduction and cost management of formulations. I'm going to talk a little bit about ingredient supply issues and regulatory changes on the next couple of slides, so I'll go into those in more detail. Product improvements. If a competitor launches a product which is performing particularly well in the market, it may be necessary to reformulate to beat that competition and manage the sort of texture, taste. We're all used to seeing these new improved labels on the front of packs. Shelf life, I've got one of my case studies is talking a little bit about shelf life. So it may be that you're experiencing issues with your current product and need to address those, or it may be that you're trying to extend the shelf life of your product. Potentially, you're going into a new market where an extended shelf life is required. And then finally, I've talked a little bit about clean label. This is something that we do see across the food industry, and we're seeing manufacturers looking to maybe remove certain ingredients from back of pack and shorten their overall ingredient label. So something that has been in the news a lot recently is an outcome of the war in Ukraine is the impact on some food ingredients. So sunflower oil is one of the primary ingredients which has been impacted, as the majority of the global supply comes from Ukraine and Russia. So many manufacturers are looking for alternatives now and having to make that switch quite quickly because um, sunflower oil is in such short supply. So switching to an alternative oil may mean that the organoleptic properties of the product are impacted. Cost is almost certainly going to be impacted because the alternative oils now, because the demand is so high, the price is increasing. Labeling, clearly, if you're changing an ingredient in your product, you need to be able to change the ingredient deck on back of pack. However, with sunflower oil, certainly in the UK, the FSA has released a statement to inform consumers that products which are labelled with sunflower oil may actually contain rapeseed oil. And this will be in place for a period of time to allow manufacturers to make that switch. The nutritional profile of the product may change. So if you switch to a fat with a more highly saturated fat content, then obviously that's going to impact on your nutritional profile. Processability may may change, so how the dough handles, how the product flows down the production line, and then finally shelf life, as again if the alternative oil is more prone to oxidation. Sunflower lecithin is also severely limited, and many manufacturers had swapped from using soy lecithin to sunflower because of some of the reluctance to use soya-based ingredients in products. They're now having to switch back to sunflower to soy lecithin because of this supply issue. And we know that wheat and corn are also impacted, and this is going to have far-reaching effects because of the number of ingredients which are derived from wheat and corn that are used within the food industry. So we expect to see the impact of the war on the food industry continuing for quite some time. Regulatory changes. One big one is the ban on titanium dioxide. And titanium dioxide is used as a whitening agent, used very widely in confectionery products, also pastries, cake decorations, and some coffee creamers. There are a number of alternative ingredients which have been developed by suppliers, and these are often based on starches and or calcium salts. The The alternatives are very application specific. So if you are looking to replace titanium dioxide in your product, you need to engage with the suppliers, understand the options, and then take those alternatives and screen them in your particular product to be able to select the most appropriate solution um, in your product. So moving on to case studies. So this first one is focusing on a shelf life complaint. And this was a snack product, and the manufacturer was receiving consumer complaints of off tastes over shelf life. And this was thought to be associated with the with rancidity of the oil that was being used in the product. So they asked for our support to carry out some accelerated testing to help make the changes and improve the product. So to do this, we used a couple of different instruments. So initially, we looked at different oils, so different suppliers of oil, different types of oil, adding antioxidants into the oil, and these were tested using the Rancimat. And this is a quick way of looking at the oxidative stability of different oils. By doing this, it enabled the client to shortlist a number of potential oils to then formulate into their product. Once they'd done this work, the final product was then analysed using the oxypress. And again, this is an accelerated instrument which elevates the temperature and oxygen in the product. And by doing this, we were able to demonstrate that the optimized oil had an improvement in oxidative stability over shelf life. And the huge benefit was that this analysis can be done in just over a week, compared to having to put the product on a full shelf life of, for example, 12 months. So the client was able to make the changes very quickly, reformulate, and reduce the number of consumer complaints. The second case study is looking at sugar reduction in confectionery. So this was as a result of Public Health England setting out targets of 20% sugar reduction in a number of food categories. And so we started by looking at options to reduce the sugar by 20%, but this was later increased to 30% to allow an on-pack claim. So we started by reviewing the potential ingredients to be able to use in this product. Because it was a confectionery product, we were really looking at bulking agents to replace the structural properties of sugar, rather than focusing on the sweetness. Whereas if you were looking at a high moisture product, you'd be looking at high potency sweeteners and sweetness enhancers. We also needed to consider the regulatory situation. So the polyols were not permitted for this application because we weren't able to achieve a 30% calorie reduction or no added sugar. The product was chocolate based, so we also needed to consider the standard of identity and ensure that the ingredients met the standard of identity. We looked at gastrointestinal tolerance because these were soluble fiber ingredients. So we needed to consider the dosage and the amount that consumers would be eating in one sitting to ensure that there was no discomfort, and also labeling on back of pack. The ingredients were screened in the product matrix, and then with the products were evaluated using QDA panels. Most promising options were then put through to consumer testing to be able to select the final formulation to go to scale up, process optimization, shelf life, and then finally product launch. So just to summarize, there are a number of drivers for reformulation. Nutritional drivers are obviously something that springs to mind for most people, but we're seeing particularly this issue with ingredient supply driving a lot of reformulation in the food industry. Consumer acceptance needs to be the primary focus when reformulating. So this is taste and texture, but also how the product is labeled on pack and how you communicate those changes to your consumer. And finally, analytical tools can really help support and accelerate reformulation. And when these are combined with sensory analysis and consumer testing, it can give a really powerful package to help support your reformulation process. So thank you for your time, and my details are on the slide if anyone would like to get in touch.